listening to Unfiltered with Mohammed Uncut, a podcast about personal growth and authentic leadership. If you're looking for tips on how to manage others, get ahead, and make your way up the corporate ladder, this is not the show for you. This podcast is about being of service to others, leading from the heart, and evolving into a better version of yourself. Each episode brings you motivated stories about unfiltered leadership and authentic leaders, those who involve others, use their influence to amplify diverse perspectives, and inspire teams to achieve collective results. If this sounds like you, keep listening. Good afternoon and welcome to the Unfiltered Podcast with Dr. Jeb Hurley as my unfiltered guest for today. Thank you for being on the show, Jeb.
You're very welcome, Mohammed. It is my pleasure.
And it's going to be my pleasure to dig deep into your expertise and what you can tell us on leadership and team building. This podcast is all about transformation. If we can't transform ourselves and learn to lead ourselves better, we certainly can't do that with others. And this is why he's here to share some of that as my unfiltered guest for today. What I really want to get to know, a lot of my listeners bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise, and they tend to come from the motivational and inspirational side of things. And you're motivational. I'm not going to turn that down because I've heard you speak and I've been watching a few of your talks and interviews. But what you really bring, and I really want to benefit from that, and hopefully the listeners can, is the science behind it. So I'm just going to ask you in your own words, who's Jeb Hurley? How'd you get into this? And why do you love it so much?
Great questions. Thank you, Mohammed. And you, of course, gave a little bit of a background about some of the things that motivated me, that insatiable curiosity about people and why, especially leaders, do what they do. And that led to a passion, and this is a perhaps later stage in my career, as we all do, as our journey progresses, our passions evolve, but around really helping organizations build better teams and using behavioral science. And for me, that curiosity, and I think that passion ultimately led to a career journey that was one of just constant reinvention around the themes of both product innovation and people development. And like all of us, particularly as we get a little older, you can look back and we have a story. And that narrative is made up of themes. And for me, those are two that are quite strong and ultimately led to that pursuit, as I navigated my way through large corporations and startups, and people played a central role in that. It led to my decision to give up weekends for 4 years. Earning a doctorate in organizational leadership, but with that focus on human motivation, team effectiveness, and engagement. And so for me, uncovering the whys as to some teams performing at extraordinarily effective levels versus those who get mired in mediocrity, and what was the difference. And that became sort of my interest, my passion, and ultimately today, is I work hard to try and bring those insights and approaches to every organization.
Mired in mediocrity. I love that because I've spoken with a few organizations who, they could put that on their mission statement, right? And
Yes.
This is the unfortunate thing is many organizations have for a mission statement to transform and enable and empower. And I find that these are just placards that we put on our walls, right? We don't really live the values that govern how we get work done. We don't, the mission statement is nothing more than a statement. It's not an action item. And I'm glad, I'm so excited about what you're going to, share with us today, because, kind of what I'm hoping you'll help us learn today, Jeb, is these organizations seem to overlook that there is a science behind how people work. They approach, many human resources organizations, and these are probably the people that are hiring you, hiring me to get things done. They approach it, hey, we've got people here. There are human assets. There are reports. There are whatever you want to call them, right? They don't see them as people. They don't see them as the the actual energy that is helping you deliver to your client whatever solution or product you're putting together. And so what they forget, everything becomes automated. It becomes, it becomes, if we're going to help these people, then let's get them into a training session that lasts a few hours, maybe once or twice a year. Great. We check it off the list, and then let's get work done. Let's get back to reality. And that break between getting into the training room and getting onto the floor and getting work done, I think that's where the rupture happens, because people think, oh, I went into training, I just got some knowledge, but how the hell do I apply this knowledge to my work? So take me there. How the heck do we apply this knowledge that we learn in training to the real work that we get to do to get things done?
Yeah, that's a great topic, and one that it's outside of the sort of work environment, and beyond the office. My passions include Western and Asian intellectual traditions, along with things like skiing and golf and the martial arts. And but you touch on something that goes very deep, because, and in fact, you can trace it back to, in Western traditions, you can trace it back to Galileo, actually. And there was Galileo had he fostered a point of view that is influenced particularly Western science and psychology and behavioral sciences, which developed much later, in this separation of cognition and sort of the scientific mind and the way we view the world from what at the time was called the more spiritual. And that's not in a religious sense, but that's more in the sort of the human energy and who we are as people. And if fast forward to the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, the turn of the 20th century, and the advent of the corporation, and you have a design that is of organizing human behavior or human interactions in a way that is really quite efficient, and it's very effective at moving, through a process from point A to point B. An idea, you act on it, and out comes an output, whether it's an automobile or today more likely a piece of software. But the point is, within that context, the human dimension tends to get left behind. And it was really and interestingly, a lot of work done during World War II and post World War II. And I write a bit about this in my most recent book, is where the behavioral dimension of leadership began to come to the forefront, because there was a realization that innovation was going to require something other than just automation in the sense of moving large sets of troops around to a point. And there's a whole history there of sort of how warfare was conducted. And it was the advent of the special services, the SAS in Britain, the early underwater demolition, which became with a precursor to the Navy SEALs, the Marine Rangers, and sort of those organizations that realized that leadership needed to evolve around a very different model. And as we moved into what was called the human resources movement in post-World War II, and particularly coming into the 1980s, there was a much greater focus and realization that if you're able to tap into enabling people to do their best and be their best in the context of the mission of the organization, that's where you get exceptional results. And so it's organizations, whether they're the military elite or in the medical profession, the Mayo Clinic comes to mind, or in corporations, who understand how to merge the very real need to build things that people want to buy at a profit. That's why organizations exist, and their shareholders invest in them, and there's nothing wrong with that. But marry that with the human dynamics of how, paying attention to where people find meaning and purpose in their work, investing in the skills for them to be able to realize that purpose and then give them the freedom to pursue it, is the key to ultimately greater inclusiveness, people being truly engaged in what they do, and ultimately performance in the work that they pursue.
Amazing, amazing. And, as you were thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the one that just did their doctorate, not me. But, even the way we've evolved. So, we went, during the time of Galileo, but the society was more encouraged to bring mind and heart together. And so before emotional intelligence existed, it existed because it was part of who we were as individuals, as human beings. But I think with the Industrial Revolution, we became cogs. We became a means to an end. So people became the resources to deliver, to make profit. And I think that's, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is where we saw the trend towards profit over people. And all of a sudden it was, how do we maximize profits? How do we deliver? How do we create? How do we, and the Industrial Revolution really put the focus on creating things as opposed to allowing people to grow. And, I feel like recently we've started talking about bringing that aspect of our, the different dimensions together. You even look at how colleges focus on the trades and universities used to focus on the letters and the more academic and the spiritual or the more mental and emotional development. Right? And only now we're starting to see those two trends coming together. Universities and colleges are starting to work together to, allow students to be hands-on, but at the same time to learn the theory, right? And we divorced ourselves into doers and thinkers. And in doing so, we became people who get things done and people who get others to get things done. And, when I look at leadership, where does a leader play in, right? What is the role of a leader? So I'm not sure if the scenario that I painted was accurate, and, please weigh in and correct me if I'm wrong, but lead me into as well, what is the role of that leader? Does the leader today have a bigger role to play in terms of leading us back to the spirituality? And again, not talking religion here, but spirituality and allowing us to become better connected with our minds and our hearts.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, and of course, leadership, one of the things that I realized as I was sort of doing my deep dive in organizational leadership, that there is many sort of definitions as pundits willing to expound on the topic. So, there's a lot of varying points of view, but I do believe that we've seen a shift over the period of time that began with, and we could spend the entire podcast and multiple others on the whole history and evolution of both leadership and sort of how social and intellectual forces influenced it. But Taylorism, certainly, Frederick Taylor and scientific management and the process-oriented, if we use that as one sort of just example, and it is a very Western example as well, but if we contrast that with more organic approaches. And interestingly, one of the ones best known today is when people talk about agile. Agile as a process and agile as leadership, which the manifesto of that actually was written not too far from my home up in Snowbird, Utah, the Snowbird ski resort. But the key to it was a recognition of a more holistic approach to thinking about the means of production and people, how they come together to ultimately meld into something much more powerful than when you just focus on the means and optimizing the means of production. So thinking of it more holistically. But I think that, leadership, if you think about today's world, in which the speed of change happens at unprecedented pace, and that has a lot to do with the enabling technologies, globalization, whether it's sort of on the upward or downward. There's still no stopping the fact that we live in an interconnected and much more team-based world that has enormous benefits to it in the means of sharing information, the means of bringing and collecting, remote work enables the best minds to come together to solve problems. But at the same time, the cost of poor leadership is staggering in today's environment, because it not only impacts the organization, but the human cost of that in a more distributed, more interconnected world. The importance of leadership, I believe, is greater than ever.
Can you go deeper on that? So the human cost, because I think, we've seen what happens when there's toxicity in an organization, or when leaders don't role model, they role play. But can you go deeper? What is the human cost? Because there's a human benefit that, hopefully you'll help us uncover. But what's the human cost? What are we losing when we have bad leadership?
Well, I think it ranges from the physical. I mean, there's been interesting research done around the correlations between the key indicators of cardiovascular disease and stress. And of course, one of the core sources of stress in our lives in general, but very specifically when it comes to work, is bosses or leader, and I hate to use the word leader, because by definition you're not a leader if you're toxic, if you're impacting your organization in that way. So someone who's been appointed into a people management role and does it poorly is going to impact people's lives. They'll impact the efficiency and the effectiveness by which things get done at work. They will drive turnover and driving up the costs of replacement and training of employees. But then on the human side, the friction and stress caused by a lack of leadership or failed leadership impacts people not only in their immediate work environment and what they get done, but they take it home. I mean, that's the amount of, whether it's substance abuse or relationships that fall apart, or impact in the community. Some company, Gallup, estimates it to be somewhere in the north of $1 trillion a year in the U.S. economy alone. So, sort of what
think of the health costs to that, right?
Exactly. So it's enormous because it affects us at a very core level. Our psychological needs as human beings when it comes to work are all pretty similar in terms of the desire to find meaning and purpose in what we do, in something that matters more than just a party of one. Who are we helping? Who are we? And our investment in our skills to be able to accomplish that purpose, and our desire to be able to be given the opportunity to pursue it, when those are impeded on, it has a very real, down to the neurobiological level. You're triggering cortisols rather than oxytocins, to not dive too deep into and beyond my expertise.
Dive.
Not the neuropsychology, but I've touched enough on it that there's a very real connection between the brain chemistry that guides how our bodies and our minds deal with stressors, deal with resilience, and how we either come back for it or don't, and leadership. And so if there's a call for more conscious leadership, for leaders for people who actually get what it means to be a leader, it's certainly, there's a very clear organizational imperative for it, but equally there's a very strong human reason and imperative for it.
And Jeb, that's why I keep, I'm pushing on that, because I think it's such a great incentive for organizations and communities and societies. And I know you talk about, the Western model, certainly when you've described, our basic purpose-driven, that I think is universally human anywhere you go. But we're talking here particularly about the Western model, right? But I think there's an incentive and why we need to do things different. And, there's been a trend. I feel the trend hasn't pushed far enough, but COVID is allowing us to, look the beast right in the face, right? Because I think right now what we're recognizing, there's many viruses we're dealing with. So there's systemic racism, but there's systemic leadership. There's bad leadership that has become systemic in our Western culture. And it has become the norm to be a certain type of leader. For men, particularly, let's say, white men who are executives, C-suite, they have become a certain sort of leader, rank and file. It's all about authority. And you don't talk about your feelings. You don't admit your vulnerabilities. You don't say where you're wrong or wrong. It's not part of the vocabulary. So aligning that with the health impacts, aligning it with the science behind it, why it's actually costing us trillions of dollars in health costs and in broken marriages and attrition and turnover and so forth. I think that in itself is an incentive for an organization to say, holy, you know what? We need to do things differently. So getting back to this mission statement, understanding that the way we get things done is a lot more critical when we approach it, that the costs are incredibly high if we continue to get it wrong. And you talk about taking teams from ordinary to extraordinary, and you talk about building trust. Tell me more about that and why you feel those are the way, that's kind of the path that organizations need to embrace and walk upon.
So I think that fundamentally, and this is when you look at leadership through a behavioral lens and look at leaders who really do exhibit the characteristics, the qualities that have enabled them to accomplish through people, not only the objectives of the organization, but also have enabled people to be their best and do their best. You get to some very fundamental behavioral dynamics. And at the core of that is really trust. And it's not just trust in the sense of, often when I talk about trust, people put it in this category of like love and hate and trust and fear, sort of the big emotions. And while that is true, trust in a leadership context has much more to do with the little actions that we take every day that either develop and sustain the trust that people have in us, in our ability to help them realize their purpose, as well as the organization versus our somewhat innate behavioral tendencies as humans to sabotage it. And that's why I place so much emphasis on the trust dimension, because at a practical level, if you get trust right, it solves a lot of the issues along the way. And as I was having in my doctoral research, I had the good fortune of working with some pretty amazing elite organizations and teams. One of them was an Israeli fighter pilot squadron. And at dinner one night, we were chatting, and one of the pilots made the comment that he said, look, we are by far not perfect human beings. We think we are. We probably have the biggest egos in Israel. He said, but what we really understand is that when we walk into the flight room before an operation, there's not an ego allowed in the room. And we understand that if there's a gap anywhere in what we expect of one another versus what we're currently feeling or experiencing, which is at the core of the definition of trust, positive expectations versus positive experiences with another person, that the likelihood of someone not coming home because our head isn't 110% in the game just went up. Right. Because we need to be able to, literally mind read at Mach 2. So right. There's that. There's a lot of lessons in that, where when you have some of the best trained people in the world, the 1% of the 1%, admitting that, we're not superhumans. But what we are is a super team. And that we understand trust as the dynamic that is so crucial to our success and actually, our lives, literally. It for me was inspiration to say, well, how do you bring that home?
And that was my question. How do you bring it home? How do you bring it to the organizations that aren't that assumingly aren't dealing with life and death situation every day. I mean, if you think about mental health and physical health, we are dealing with life and death situations every day, but it's not at the same, it's not at Mach 2 speed, right? But how do you bring it to these organizations? How do you bring it home?
Yeah, that's that is a challenge. And it's a little bit, Mohammed, what you alluded to earlier is that you get, and by the way, it's not just in Western culture. I lived recently 8 years in Asia,
Singapore,
and worked with leaders or managers and of all culture, across cultures across Asia, which is probably one of the most multidimensional, multicultural places, in the world. And I can tell you that Western culture has, and Western companies do not have the monopoly on bad leadership and bad models, and they may have evolved differently out of different roots, but they can still go quite bad or good. It's both. No one also has the market on the right way to think about or to implement leadership. But to your question of bringing it home, it's what I have found is that it has to start with someone and at an individual level who actually gets leadership in the sense of being conscious of that leadership itself is more about having the humility to listen, the courage to make the tough decisions while taking into consideration all that they've heard. And that they've got the passion to inspire people to be their best and do their best. And with that as a foundation, introducing the idea that you can take trust out of the realm of big emotions that we have difficulty controlling to something we actually can measure. And it comes down to that, there's that Peter Drucker, if you, and it's an adage that I do believe that things that get measured get moved, or if you can't measure it, you're going to have trouble improving it, whichever way you want to paraphrase his brilliant thinking. But that when you bring the ability to, particularly for young leaders, for them to see how trust relates to the performance of their team and their ability to achieve its objectives, as well as the listening to the feedback from the individuals on your team, you create a dynamic and a direction that puts teams on the roads to excellence. But it all comes down to, in the real world, that ability to take something out of the abstract and move it into the concrete. Because whether we like it or not, corporations, businesses, it is about focusing on the things that make a difference in a way where we can measure the impact, because it requires an investment. And the more that you can do that and tie things like trust and the strength of relationships behaviorally to how you evaluate the effectiveness of a leader, you've now set up a virtuous circle where building little trust ladders on my team results in better results. I'm a better leader for it. I should be getting promoted for that and rewarded. And you set up this wonderful cycle that, without that core dynamic of measuring trust at its core, you never get on that cycle. And what you end up with is what is more typical today, which is a lot of tools that are brought into organizations based on sort of 20th century models and ideas that are more, we talk about teams, they're focused on the individual. Engagement is a great example of, the measuring engagement. It's like taking your temperature. It may be high, it may be low. It doesn't give you a clue as to what's really wrong or how to fix it.
And you don't know which way it's going at any given time, right?
Yes, and the nature of engagement measures in and of itself don't lend themselves nicely to a fluid, time or temporal based way that reflects how we as human beings experience our work. The original work done by in the 1990s around engagement, well, first off, it was done at camps for kids, which is kind of interesting. But more importantly, it was never designed for the way in which it's used today. And it doesn't help a leader, a young leader in particular, capture the dynamics that are actually going on with people on their teams in order to help them be better.
Well, as you talk about it and you say the word dynamic, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to talk to my leaders about respect and trust and fear and love. And when I talk to them as intangibles, you can't measure those. It's hard to measure those. And then you start looking at, well, how can we measure them by behaviors or actions? But when you take trust, as you were explaining, and if I understood you correctly, and you're going to use the word transactional. Usually when I use the word transactional, it has a negative connotation to it because it means one time. But I'm going to say multiple transactions. So when you turn trust into a transaction, as Stephen Covey would say, do you invest in reap dividends, or in the lack of trust, do you have taxes that you pay, right? If you've got trust, use it as a currency in your organization, things will get done faster. The lack of trust means it'll take more time, more money. Distrust means that there's suspicion, things aren't going to get done. And, through that transaction of, do we trust each other? Do I trust you enough to let you put your hand in my pocket and take out enough money and then go spend it with no questions asked? Would you do that? I don't know if I do that with my wife. Would I say, is she around? Here's the credit card, right? I'm like, how much are you going to put on it, right? And, it's amazing. But you think about it, whether it's in jest or in seriousness, it's difficult for us to extend that much trust. How do you recommend for teams to go from ordinary to extraordinary? How can we extend the right form of trust to help us, propel us forward and turn it so that it's not a gauge going up and down, but it's one that's always spiraling into improvement?
Yeah, good question. I found that in both my work and my research, there's really three behaviors that are exhibited by exceptionally good leaders who deliver exceptional results consistently. So it's not just, hey, this is a great guy. It's no, this is a leader and a team that consistently outperform their peer cohorts. And they do three things. And the really powerful aspect of these three behaviors is that anybody can do it. It's kind of the irony. And it's often our own biases. There's a lot of reasons why, and we can go into that. But those three are pretty straightforward. The first one is that exceptional teams and their leaders understand the importance of establishing a very clear set of norms or values by which they are going to assess one another and guide one another with it. So it's not the plaque on the wall. That's a waste of paper and plastic. It's a team who says, having everyone has a voice, that we don't tolerate bias. And if someone experiences it, because their unconscious bias is unconscious, but we make it conscious. We put it on the table. Psychologically, safety is a given on this team. So you can go down the list. And the key is that those behaviors, again, are not only agreed upon by the team, but they're used actively in order for that team to function. And that is the foundation, because without that, how do you have trust? If you can't trust that you can give voice to an issue on your team or to your manager, to your team leader, then seriously, how much is going to get left off the table that would have helped this team? And you can just go down and, every day in the newspaper, you see examples of companies who have failed to articulate and proactively use a set of core values to guide and assess their leaders, their managers, and their people. And they're in the news because of fraud. They're in the news because of harassment. It's sad how rampant it is. And And more because how simple it is actually to put that in place. But it's not enough. The second dimension is that you have to recognize that when someone comes into an organization, and this is why elite, particularly elite units, whether it's military or sports or in medicine, you go through a long period of cultivating not only the best of the best that fit with the norms, but also the purpose. Why is someone there? It's kind of like if everyone hired for purpose instead of just skills or how they did on some test, but why really, motivationally, is someone showing up saying, I want to be part of your team?
And if I may,
yeah,
is the purpose, this makes me breathe. So I just want to make sure I can ask before I forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is the purpose the mission, the company's mission, or the personal purpose, or a different purpose altogether? Or all three?
Great question. Yes, it's all of the above. Because here's why that's so important. If you think, let me use I'll use a completely out of work story and analogy. I remember when my daughter was, I don't know, one and a half, I can't remember exactly, but whenever kids start to brush their teeth, what I remember is
15.
So how important, yeah, right. Yeah, guys, this is a girl, right? So I remember, I have this great sense of purpose. So I'm the organization, this is mom and dad. I have a great sense of purpose of why this is so important. And this is a norm and a value in our organization, our household. Everybody should brush their teeth. And there's good reasons, health reasons. There's good reasons, just, hygiene. Now, an 1.5-year-old or 2-year-old, she looks at this thing with this stuff on it that I just handed it and said, put it in your mouth. And she's like, ain't happening. Why would I do this? This makes no sense. I've been, the entire time I've been on this earth, nobody's asked me to put some weird tasting stuff in my mouth and move this thing around. So that's what happens when people are coming into organizations. We forget sometimes as leaders that new person doesn't share our purpose, our values. And a big part of our mission as a leader is to make it theirs. Take it from extrinsic to it will never be intrinsic in its true psychological sense. We integrate it sufficiently that today, by the time she was 3 years old, brushing her teeth, she got it. It's like, yeah, this is part of who I am. It's now part of my values, my norms that exactly. And ultimately those become, in some instances, habits. And most importantly, in that foundation of, we had a norm, which is we will have good, gentle hygiene. That as an individual, I now connected my own purpose with the organization's purpose. And so we've got this marrying of the two. And as long as, and we helped her develop the skill set to be able to brush her teeth effectively and, the rewards. And so all of those things until she became autonomous in her ability and desire to brush her teeth. It's no different as you're building an exceptional team and organization. You have to bring people in and have their purpose and values as individuals align with the purpose and values of the organization. And when you have a whole team that helps with that, as opposed to a plaque on the wall, it makes all the difference.
Amazing.
So now you've set the stage with two relatively simple processes to build the trust that ultimately, and the relationship dynamics that create sustained high performance. And that is where where leadership really does come in, because this is about leading and helping manage the relationship dynamics that are part of human beings coming together to accomplish something. So how you as a leader walk people through the cycle of how you gather feedback and insights into where people are at as a team, your ability to identify gaps that get in the way of a team functioning effectively, either on the team, across other teams that may be marketing and sales, or sales and engineering, product management, or customer success, and with you, the leader, your ability, you're having the courage and the desire to create a virtuous cycle there is the third element, where actively managing relationships on a team in a way that identifies and exposes issues early. If you've got toxic behaviors, people are people. You may have in fact, I just dealt with an organization I was working with a week or so ago, where they have a senior team and someone new came in and completely changed the dynamics of how that was working together. So they went from something pretty high functioning, literally in a space of 4 weeks, to something very challenging in terms of, and not because as I spoke with each of these senior leaders, as an individual, it was like, hey, each one of them was fine. I saw some you always have little personality indications of, but it was the interaction of that group that became toxic.
Well, and it's chemical, right? Like it's like adding a different chemical to the mix. All of a sudden, you've got a different reaction.
Yes, or a dinner party where you just got the wrong guest coming, and it just blows up. And it's like, what happened here? So for a leader, that ability to anticipate, it's like radar, anticipate things that are coming at you that are being caused by the behavioral dynamic is the third key. So the foundation of norms and values, the integration of those, which is what inspires individual motivation, and then actively managing the relationships on a team, not allowing them to meander into whatever. Those are the three behaviors that I saw on every single exceptional team that I worked with. And interestingly, on every mediocre team, there was at least one of those dimensions missing, sometimes more than one. And often it was the foundational, the norms, values dimension. They hadn't gotten that right, so everything else cascaded. So you're sort of you were trying to build something on a very shaky foundation from day one.
And when you don't have trust as your foundation, you've got nothing.
Yes, that's exactly right. Now, I've also worked with and seen team leaders who came into teams new that had a shaky foundation, who didn't have that dynamic of inspiring motivation at an individual level, and by being very patient and persistent in creating the trust, by listening, by identifying gaps, closing gaps, built the trust ladders that fix the other two. So trust that's where trust, you can go top to bottom and find where it plays an absolutely pivotal role in creating and sustaining high performance teams.
And Jeb, I'm going to be selfish here because I'm working on a project right now about bias. And before this interview, I was listening to you talk about bias, and you brought up bias right now. And right now, with everything that's going on in the world, there's education everywhere. We're dealing with what happened with George Floyd and the amplification of Black lives. And every organization is jumping out there to react and to provide training and education. One of these is that I'm in the midst of is unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
What I heard from you is if we're going to take unconscious bias education to the next level, we're going to have to start by making unconscious bias conscious. We're going to put it on the table. We're going to talk about the elephant in the room. We're not going to be afraid to acknowledge what our biases are, but be ready to move forward and do more. Did I hear you correctly? That's kind of the first step there, right? To build that trust is to make unconscious bias conscious.
Yeah, I would even say there's a precursor step to that, because the unconscious bias in and of itself it's bias on bias. It tends to have a negative connotation. And I think it's really important for people to understand that the notion of unconscious bias, and if we take it to, for instance, fight or flight, unconscious biases serve a very valuable and real purpose. Whether it was sort of back in a time where you probably don't want to hang out if you've got a saber-toothed cat stalking while you're gathering in the field. 2, is that car going to run the red light or the stoplight? With that,
it's your natural bias to react in a certain way.
Exactly. So recognizing that biases serve a purpose. However, when those those positive dynamics turn into a confirmation bias or an affinity bias where I begin excluding people who aren't like me. And I did that for a very good reason 10,000 years ago, because they were likely to kill me. Today, it's more a matter of first acknowledgement, saying, look, you, I, everybody we know, we are wired to have unconscious biases. Fine. Now that we admit and acknowledge that, let's talk about how we can, as you said, put them on the table. How do we help each other by saying, hey, what you just said, really, that was a pretty exclusionary statement. And by the way, you probably didn't mean that. These subtle acts of exclusion are the ones that really sort of in small ways make people, even on a diverse team, make people feel excluded rather than included. And the key again is you got to have people who are willing to have, both that have the courage to accept the feedback, and others who are willing to point out and say, hey man, I know you didn't mean that, but that could have been interpreted this way. And that's the key.
And when you have trust, that's when you're able to put that on the table. And I can tell you that without the fear of retribution or reprisal, or that it's going to break our relationship. And this is so
exactly
right. It's so important because organizations across the world right now are awakening to the fact that we need to do more. But more isn't just going and reading a book to help us reset or recalibrate what we could be doing better. It's not just about the educational part. It's about how do I take that education and put it into action. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We want to take that sense of training or education and take it out of the training room and say, now you're on, this is live. You've got a role to play. And as a leader, and leadership is a mindset we can all adopt, how are you going to get this done? Are you going to build trust and call out the elephant in the room? Or are you going to always tippy-toe around it, right?
Exactly. And that was one of the ahas out of my doctoral work that ultimately led to Xmetryx, and what I'm doing today was that connect the dots between, the way these elite teams make it happen is through this rigorous training and filtering. And and that ain't happening. We're not going to take our new MBAs and take them down to Coronado Beach and water them down for 3 weeks, right? So that's not going to happen. As much as perhaps some people think maybe that's not a bad idea.
It'll make a difference, won't it, right?
Exactly. But if you can provide people the means by which they can safely express gaps in trust. So what I expected of my team leader, other teams, versus what I'm experiencing. And then when you visualize, to some extent, perhaps gamify, but make that part of the team's experience of shared learning, developing shared mindsets together, you get kind of the Navy SEAL effect without having to go through the same kind of rigorous process. But the key to that is, and it comes back to conscious leadership. You have to have leadership in an organization who say, this is important. We're not going to just measure revenue, net income, and X, and Y and Z. We're also going to measure the people dynamics there, and in particular on teams, trust turns out to be. If you're not going to measure anything else, get at the level of trust people are expressing towards one another and their other colleagues and their boss, because that will give you a better indicator of not only the health of the team, but also its likely performance than anything else.
Jeb, this is where I would have said this is so intuitive to human nature that it's not brain science, but I guess I'm wrong. It is brain science. This is science.
That's right. It's not rocket science, but it is definitely brain science.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, I thank you for being that well of knowledge for us today, because what you shared, some of us may have had some introduction into it, in what I do in my training and all this sort of stuff. For others, this could be completely brand new, but it's not. Wherever we sit on the spectrum of being aware of this or not, it's not difficult. It's not rocket science. A lot of us can actually get this. The way you walked us through it, it makes sense, right? And it makes health sense. It makes money sense. And it makes sense in terms of how we can lead. So I thank you for sharing that. But this is where I want to turn the light back on you and ask you, I've got something called the unfiltered thought of the week. So with your expertise and your background and your just all the wonders that you've been exposed to through your training and your education and what you do for a living, what one nugget of wisdom or advice or aha moment could you share to help people become a better leader or a better human being, somebody who can maybe leverage trust better in their relationships?
Yeah, I think that first, buy a good mirror. By far, I think that has, in my experience, both having failed to have one for a while, getting a good one and learning to use it. And I wrote an article a couple of years ago called Aristotle's Mirror, Reflections on Leadership. And I chose that because of the quote attributed to Aristotle. There's some debate about it, but basically along the lines that, we are our habits. And we are what we do, and therefore, excellence truly is a matter of habit and choice, just as mediocrity is. And often people don't realize that mediocrity is a choice. If you're not choosing to reflect, if you're not choosing to understand yourself and the impact that you have on others, you are choosing. You may not be. Your ego may not allow you to admit it, but you are choosing to be mediocre. And so I think that first and foremost, the ability to reflect, because that's listening, not having the humility and the courage to listen to others, which is the next really important thing. But it's having the courage, and it does take courage in some instances, and humility, to listen to ourselves, to look and see who we are, and asking questions like, why should anyone want to follow me? Why, if I aspire to be a leader, why? What, sort of what is it other than, I'm your boss and somebody put me into a role? That's not leadership. That's being appointed a manager that people report to you and you do their. But anyone who thinks that's leadership is living been living in a cave for the last 50 years. So I think, my first and foremost, that if it was a single piece of advice, it's get a good mirror. And let me ask you, normally when I've heard the expression of buy a mirror, get a good mirror, I think of using someone to become my mirror. But to your point, I can turn that mirror upon myself and look at my actions and reflect, and that it should start there first, right? Yeah, I think it's when I do a fair amount of mentoring, career coaching, just not as a professional, because I enjoy it. And I have, whether it was people in my organizations or just people outside, one of the things I always encourage someone to do is take your resume and rewrite it, literally rewrite it from the perspective of, this is your story. And you've made a series of decisions throughout your career. Why? What was the impact? How did you feel? And ultimately, what are the themes that emerge out of your narrative that define who you are? And if that's the connect the dots to where you find purpose. For people who struggle with, I'm not sure where I find purpose. Great. Look at what you've done. We are our habits. You've made decisions, some good, some bad, some worked out well, some didn't. Fine. But think of yourself not as a bunch of roles with job titles and paychecks and results, but as a human being, and follow that path back from high school or university forward. And it's always, I promise everyone that I've encouraged to do that it will be enlightening, because you will look at yourself through a different lens, through a mirror that is far more powerful than the one that others bestowed upon us. Yeah.
We are our own story unfolding. We get to choose how many words we write, right? And I always say act or be acted upon. And now, turn that mirror against yourself first and reflect. Thank you so much for your insight, your expertise, your energy, and your knowledge, and for being my unfiltered guest today. Stay blessed. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Unfiltered, the show about authentic leadership and personal growth. Like what you heard? Click subscribe, share it, and tell a friend about it. And don't forget to leave a rating.